Hello, and welcome to this virtual conversation on creating greater diversity, inclusion, and access for learning abroad. It is my honor to kick off this discussion on behalf of my colleagues at the State Department. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are important for the United States and have been championed by our leaders. President Biden said, "Equal opportunity is the bedrock of American democracy, and our diversity is one of our country's greatest strengths." We believe the diversity of America is foundational to our economic and political success. It increases innovation and economic development and promotes stability and democracy. Our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said, "Diversity and inclusion make us stronger, smarter, more creative, and more innovative." However, we recognize that the United States has not been and is not even close to perfect in making this a reality for all our citizens. One of the reasons the United States is resilient and enduring is that when we admit our failures, we work hard to correct and learn from them. We know that we have not lived up to our ideals of freedom, democracy, and equality for all, and we are working to reorient ourselves toward those values. Self-correction through civic action is a vital part of the democratic process. We know that truly championing diversity, equity, and inclusion in international education is going to require a lot of work by all of our stakeholders in the field. We have a wonderful opportunity before us now to rebuild our international education systems back better, especially in terms of diversity, access, and equity. We at the State Department look forward to listening and learning from our panelists and all participating today on how we can increase accessibility and participation for diverse students. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Becca. I'm John Lucas, President and CEO of ISEP Study Abroad. As Becca said, on behalf of the U.S. State Department's USA Study Abroad branch, U.S. Mission Australia, U.S. Mission New Zealand, U.S. Embassy in Suva, and ISEP Study Abroad, I want to welcome you. Of course, a special welcome to our colleagues from Fiji, from New Zealand, and from Australia, as well as our U.S. colleagues joining us in today. We're just delighted to have our State Department colleagues championing diversity and inclusion and to partner, Becca, with you and all of your colleagues. This is wonderful. This program is part of a series co-sponsored by the State Department, Fulbright Finland, AIEA, and ISEP. Let me start by just introducing our two panelists who will be sharing with us today. Lynn Doe is an expert in climate justice, social inequality, and leadership development. Lynn is currently Director of Leaders for Global Sustainability at the University of Melbourne and a board member at Climate Action Network Australia. You can find her on LinkedIn and Twitter. And BJ Titus is joining us. He's currently the Director of Institutional Relations, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Learning Abroad Center at the University of Minnesota. He oversees the institutional relations for the office and diversity efforts both abroad and at the University of Minnesota campus in the Twin Cities. BJ has worked in education abroad since 2002 at the University of Minnesota and at Macalester College in Minnesota also. He holds a BA in Spanish Studies and Linguistics and an MA in Comparative and International Development Education from the University of Minnesota. BJ has presented on numerous diversity topics, including heritage seeking, GLBTQIA, and developing trainings on U.S. identities for on-site staff members. He is currently chair-elect for the Education Abroad Knowledge Community within NAFSA. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion mean many different things in different cultural contexts around the world, and the speakers are going to discuss today a little bit about these topics from their particular cultural heritage and points of view. But we want to emphasize this isn't about best practices, it's about better practice and better practices. The terms can sometimes be confusing, but we want everyone to understand we're in a process of greater improvement. I think Rebecca pointed that out really clearly for all of us. We may not be best, but we can always be better. So this is a process of greater improvement and ever widening access to these important mobility programs. As Becca said, listening is key, but sharing your strengths and weaknesses in an honest, open way is also important. We've gathered some information about all of your strengths in your registration process, and we've used that to help put you in some breakout groups that pair you with folks that have similar strengths, but hopefully different, diverse backgrounds. We want you to connect with meaningful partners. So please indicate in the post-meeting survey if this has met your needs and if there are additional other partners you'd like to meet so we can continue to help connect you. One of the roles ISEP loves to play is convener, and we love to connect colleagues and introduce people to new friends and new partners. The speakers are going to share their definitions, their personal experiences, and some guiding questions to hopefully spark your interest and provoke some conversation in the breakout rooms, where you'll work on your own institutional D&I planning. Afterwards, we'll bring you back to the main Zoom room here to summarize some common threads from the breakout groups and hopefully answer some lingering questions. Now, this is just an hour. It's a short session. It's going to fly by and it's going to be too short. I know that already. We will have a recording of the session available as soon as we possibly can. So that will help. And will also help you in the follow-ups to make connections with your colleagues. This session is designed to be a first catalyst, the beginning of a conversation with what we hope will become some of your new friends and new partners in this important endeavor to build more diversity, equity, inclusion in the field of education abroad. As president of ISEP, I can offer the full support of our organization and our vast network of members and affiliates around the globe to be your partners. Please consider ISEP a friend, a colleague, an ally in your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So let's kick this off right away. I'm going to start with BJ, who's going to share his perspective and offer some guiding questions and examples that we can begin with. And then Lynn will speak for 10 minutes and give us some structure and point of view from her work at the University of Melbourne. So go ahead and kick it off, BJ.
Thank you, John, very much. And on behalf of Lynn and I, we're very happy to be here. I think the goal is to really get all of you to be talking in the small group. So Lynn and I will be giving an opening statement, but we really want to focus that time on the individual breakout rooms. As John mentioned, my name is BJ Titus. I'm with the Learning Abroad Center at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. My time is divided, and about 25% of my time is focused on diversity and inclusion work. With that, I'm curating and coordinating trainings and workshops for our staff in the United States office. And then I'm creating and supplying resources and trainings to our on-site staff around the world focused on diversity and inclusion efforts from a US diverse student perspective. My connection to this region, my first time to the Australia-Oceania region was in 2015, where I spent about a week at the University of Canberra listening to the work that they've been doing supporting diverse students and meeting with anyone on campus who was doing diversity work and really hearing and listening of what Australia is doing that could really help inform the work that I was trying to be doing at the University of Minnesota. I've been back numerous times over these past 6 years, and one of the highlights is attending and presenting at the Australian International Educators Conference twice now, where I've gone to talk about diversity in the United States as it compares to Australia. Some of the differences in diversity and inclusion that surprised me when I first came to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the region was in the US, the diversity conversation spans many different identities, a lot of different identities. And oftentimes when someone says diversity, they actually mean race in the United States, and they don't necessarily mean diversity at large. And in Australia, I was surprised that in the higher education world of diversity, it was really more focused on socioeconomic status, or SES, and whether or not the individuals were Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And while Australia is talking about class, when it comes to socioeconomic statuses, I don't feel like the US audiences really focus enough on class. To complicate socioeconomic status even more in Australia, they go by postal code, which is something I had no idea until I attended that AIEC conference. So they do postal code when it comes to socioeconomic status and not by individual family income. So you could be a rich family in a poorer neighborhood or a poor family in a richer neighborhood, and you'd be counted the same as your neighbors. For anyone on this Zoom call outside of the United States, in the US, we base it on the FAFSA, and it goes by expected family contribution when we're looking at a student's financial aid package and what they'll be paying to go to university. There are numerous grants and scholarships out there that may aid students in their package and oftentimes loans, but it is based on what the government thinks your family will contribute, not necessarily what they will actually be contributing to your educational costs. The US colleagues on the call today may define diversity different than I define diversity, which is also some of what complicates this work, but also makes it exciting. All the time we're talking about different identities that I hadn't thought of or haven't been supporting at the University of Minnesota. And conversations like this really do help me think beyond kind of what I've been doing in a day-to-day basis. Even Diversity Abroad, which is an organization in the US that focuses on supporting US diverse students, doesn't always necessarily agree with my view of diversity or others' view of diversity. So I think this will be an interesting discussion when you get into your breakout rooms. When I was asked kind of what I'm doing to support diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially during this COVID world, there's a couple things that immediately floated to mind. Some of you, many of you, I assume, have heard of the murder of George Floyd, which happened last May in Minneapolis, just 3 miles from our campus and about less than a mile from where I live. And I need to mention this partly because the trial of the officer that murdered George Floyd, the jury selection actually began today in Minneapolis. So it's a heavy place in Minneapolis today, and I want to make sure that we address that because it is and it does impact our students and their lived experiences. After the murder of George Floyd, one of the things we really wanted to focus on was to have conversations with our staff from around the world to make sure that they understood what this meant. A lot of them, when the murder happened, were so surprised that something like that would happen in Minneapolis, that it's this great place that we've all visited. We love this place. How could something like this happen? And what we realized we've done, the staff at the University of Minnesota, is we've done a disservice to our on-site staff in the fact that we've never really talked about the bad things that happen in our community, the racial injustice that happens in our community. Minneapolis is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, especially in nowadays, where it still is divided, and people don't necessarily know that and may not realize that is occurring still today. And we want to make sure to point out these disparities, because when we highlight all the good things about a city, they don't necessarily know how that's going to impact diverse students when it comes to their experiences abroad. After we had this kind of large conversation with our staff, we had individual follow-up Zoom calls with every single country. So these were 90-minute calls with each country to listen to them, to hear about their experiences with diverse students, offer resources, and help them understand where US students are coming from. Again, all of our students now have had this collective experience in Minneapolis. They're coming to the locations around the world changed. They have a different outlook, they have a different perspective, they're different students than the students that were coming pre-George Floyd. Not to say that that is the only thing that changed them, but it's a collective experience that we all had together. Some of the things that we've come out of these conversations is to really create some sort of plan on how to support students that are coming to these different locations. And this is something that we'll be doing or starting the process in the breakout rooms later on today. Some concrete examples, this could be a do and don't list for homestays, for both students going into homestays as well as homestays receiving US students. It could be something like an explanation of microaggressions or other terms that are out there that they may hear or not understand. One location asked for updated language. Language is constantly changing and not everyone agrees on the terms that could be used, but there are some things that have fallen out of fashion. One of our on-site staff members was shocked that they were listening to the Supreme Court Justice hearings for Amy Coney Barrett and was shocked of the feedback that she got for using the term sexual preference. And our on-site staff member said, I've been using that for years. In the 90s, the University of Minnesota told me to use that. And we realized we hadn't updated them on how language has changed and how sexual preference is not a term that's necessarily used or one that's widely accepted. The other thing that we're working on is taking case studies of incidents that have occurred over the last year on programs on site, taking out the specifics about the student, and take those as a learning opportunity for everyone to be able to learn from those experiences and say, well, that may have happened in Australia, it could happen in New Zealand, it could happen in Fiji, it could happen somewhere else. And so I think you could really learn from everyone all around. The other thing we're doing is that we're surveying all of our on-site staff and asking them about specific experiences that students may be asking about. Some things concrete, something like, where could a Black person get their haircut in your city? Some attitudinal conversations, how are students who use wheelchairs going to be perceived in your country? But some of this is getting our staff around the world to really think about what types of US students they may be receiving. In the past, we'd always done these surveys in person, but with COVID, we've moved them online. They're not as dynamic, they're not necessarily a conversation, but we're having everyone think about that. The other thing we're looking at before I'm out of time is looking at our orientations, both our on-site orientations as well as our pre-departure orientations, and make sure that we're including diversity, equity, and inclusion work throughout all of them. And even if that means adding a second orientation on site to make sure that we are covering everything we need to cover, we want to make sure that we're doing that. With that, I will put in the chat some of the guiding questions that we hope to have for the breakout session, and I will turn it over to Lynn.
Perfect. Thanks for that, BJ. And I think also just really highlighting how better practices is really what we're aiming for and not best practices. And all of this is constantly evolving, really culturally different in various places as well. And I think what BJ and I are sharing here today is some of our experiences, both within higher education and in my case, outside of higher education, when it comes to how we can approach diversity. And, you know, all of the different subsets that fall under diversity as well. So my name is Lynn and I'm joining you from Melbourne, Australia today. And I just wanted to do a very brief acknowledgement of country of the traditional owners, which are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. They're the Indigenous elders of the land in which I happen to live and currently work and live from home as well. Growing up, I didn't know who the traditional owners of the land where I lived or went to school was at all. It was something that I had maybe seen at really big sporting events, but it was something that I never really understood why it was happening. It had never really been explained to me. And I think my first hot tip, if you will, around any sort of diversity effort that you might embark upon is that it's just as important to be communicating about what you're doing and why you're doing it as it is to actually do whatever the action might be, so that others can also understand. And I think part of that is also about the role that we all play in continually educating ourselves. I think for many people, the moment you notice, oh, that's a different word that you've used, when you ask why, you understand why things might be evolving, and you understand how, if you didn't recognize that, how are others around you able to recognize the same thing? And I really recognize that this is a fine line to balance in terms of talking about all of the things that we're doing for diversity or calling out what we're doing. It can often feel a little bit meta. And given that yesterday/today, depending on where you're calling from, is International Women's Day, I'm sure that you've noticed a lot of different posts. And some critics and some cynics would say, oh, that's very performative. You're just saying the right thing at the right times. But I think what you say is equally as important as what you do as well. And it's how do you do both when it comes to diversity? And I'm really excited, I guess, to be here today to share with you some of my thoughts and experiences. And we don't have time to hear or participate in all of the breakout rooms that will happen later. But one of the things that I'd really love and encourage you to think about is, well, why did you choose to attend this webinar today? Diversity is definitely a very hot topic right now. It's trendy. It probably has been for the last few years. But digging deeper and understanding why diversity matters specifically for you then allows for you to think about, well, why does it matter in the context of your community? How does it matter in the context of your job? What does this mean for the organization that you're working in? What are some of the things that you could be asking for from your institution if you're not in a role such as BJ's, where you're able to be implementing some of these opportunities? Is there someone that you could be asking, could we be doing more? So I think, as I've just said, to be effective on continuing to challenge our own understanding and learning on what is diversity, what does that look like in various contexts. We need to have both that macro understanding of what's happening at that systems level. So, you know, what's happening in your city. So BJ, again, really appreciate you highlighting what's going on in Minneapolis, because I think that news definitely traveled to Australia, but also to understand it from the micro level as well. For me, I break it down with higher education. On the macro level, sometimes diversity means that discrimination or very systemic challenges leads to students from various backgrounds never being able to graduate or even being enrolled in the institutions that we work in. But on a micro level, it might mean that you actually work with someone who is sitting in the same office as you or on the same Zoom call as you, has a whole series of questions that they're contemplating and, you know, worried that they might be asked one day, and you have no understanding of that because it's a very different experience to your own. For me, I try to boil my diversity practice quite simply, and maybe sometimes a little bit too simply, down to how is it that I can show up for other people in my immediate surrounds who might have historically or traditionally not had the easiest of times, if you will, doing something as simple as raising their voice in a meeting room, or not questioning whether or not they belong in a particular situation at any time. I think for me, that's been really important, and it really matters personally because I guess in many different ways, my own upbringing was relatively diverse, if you will. I was the first person in my family to go to university. I grew up not speaking English, but at the same time, I'm also an able-bodied, cisgendered person and, you know, very heteronormative in various other ways. And no one ever wants to feel like they're the token person in the room. But I think what's worse than that is having to feel as if you need to hide any aspect of who you are. So this is why, you know, diversity is now often also talked about in the realms of how do we do the equity piece? How do we do the inclusion piece? How do we do the justice piece to it as well? Fortunately for me, in my own upbringing, I was also very young and arrogant, and it shielded me from a lot of discrimination that I may have, you know, implicitly or intentionally faced. And part of this ignorance is also, I think, where I get my hope from, is that with every generation where we continue to talk about what diversity means, why it matters, how it evolves, some of these hurdles that I had to clear, again, consciously or subconsciously, become easier, smaller, or completely removed entirely. So that's, I guess, again, just another thing that I really wanted to reiterate around how it's important to consider your own role in this, because that will impact how you turn up to various organizational things, how you might react to initiatives that, you know, feel like they're really weird and unnecessary. Why do we have another day for yet another thing? But actually that might really matter to someone to know that there's someone in their corner. So as someone who's relatively new to higher education, I have to admit, I was pretty surprised when I joined not just the University of Melbourne, but just, you know, various conversations in the broader sector around how far behind we are on some diversity measures. The reason why I shared a little bit about myself before is one of the conversations that I think is happening alongside many diversity conversations is around the role of lived experience, and how do you value knowledge that comes from people that have direct firsthand experience, even if they don't necessarily have a PhD or reams of data to back up what it is that they are feeling or have experienced. And that, again, is a really fine line to balance, particularly within the context of higher education, where we really do value people that have done much research about what they've done. And that's not at all a discredit to building upon some of that knowledge and some of the information that's possible there. But how do you also ask people that actually know what it might be like to have to operate and live in a wheelchair, where it's their constant day to day rather than just something that happens as a once off? So something that I think we in the higher education space really need to do here is value anecdotal evidence as well, especially when it's coming from our students, and just stopping for a minute when someone questions, hey, this isn't working for me, hey, this is something that I could be doing better, rather than throwing back a statistic at this person, or well, you know, best practice is this. Consider what is the better practice here of how you could ask them for more information, for them to explain exactly what their context is, so that potentially something at a larger and more systemic and organizational wide culture could be enacted and implemented on. So I think in the case of the University of Melbourne, again, recognizing that diversity means different things in different ways, we need to think about how we go about our diversity measures, first with how we engage with the broader community. So what is our role in the city that we happen to be in? What is our relationship and our responsibility when it comes to how we address diversity for our students? And what does that look like for our staff as well, and how we organizationally structure ourselves? And on some fronts, we've been doing a better job. And on other fronts, we are definitely still lagging behind. So I think some of the things that we've done particularly well over the last few years, for example, have been given the importance of Indigenous reconciliation in Australia and how that sort of really needs to feed into all of the different levels of change required. We now have specific institutes. One is just to foster Indigenous knowledge. And again, that helps to bridge how do you document 40,000 years of history where a PhD might not be what represents that knowledge, but there are other forms, and how do we recognize and acknowledge and celebrate that as a institution of higher learning. But then there's separately to that also an institution that looks at what is the student experience like if you are an Indigenous person at the University of Melbourne, where similarly you might be the first person of your family to come into an institution that, you know, historically again has been responsible for a fair amount of colonization and whitewashing of information of your ancestors. So that's something that I think we're definitely still on a learning process on. It's very specific and unique to Australia. Something that, again, we're still very much on that pathway of is LGBTIQA awareness and recognition of that on campus. It was only 3 years ago that the university actually offered the first ever awareness training information session for staff, which I think when you look around at potentially what your own institution is doing, or what even corporate Australia, corporate America is doing in terms of their participation in things like Mardi Gras and Pride, I think it's a pretty fair assessment to say that 3 years ago is not particularly revolutionary and definitely being a bit of a laggard. But that said, it's better to start at some point in time and again, aim for that better practice rather than just aiming for best practice. And I think that acknowledges different institutions for different reasons might be slower on various uptakes for different reasons, and that is entirely fine. I've just realized that I've come to my time, so I won't get to share a little bit about some of how other sectors have come on board with, you know, diversity, but hopefully that gives you enough to talk about. And I believe BJ's posted some of the questions that we hope to hear your discussions on in the breakout group. So over to John, I think, for the next bit.
Welcome back, everyone. We're going to talk just a little bit. I was kind of bouncing around rooms, so hopefully that didn't disrupt your conversations too much. But I wanted to pull some of the tangible things that I was hearing about from the different groups. Some of the things that have been a challenge in this DEI world is with COVID happening, there's been layoffs in some offices, some organizations, some universities, and unfortunately some of the DEI people have been affected by that. And so there's not even someone to necessarily turn to when it comes to some of the guiding principles. Also, a lot of people have been relying on their DEI offices, if they exist at their university or at their organization, that they can be a real resource to make sure that people are on the right track and get buy-in for anything they're thinking about creating, so that they're kind of not creating something in a bubble that they may be creating as, you know, for me as a cisgendered white man, I want to make sure that I'm not just creating things that I like or that I want to make sure to have included, but make sure to get the buy-in from around campus. Some other things, Indigenous student spaces being set up at universities, which was really exciting to hear, as well as different frameworks that are being created that can really help guide the conversation, whether it be within the organization or at the university at large. Lynn, was there anything that you would like to, oh, you just jumped in the chat, but feel free to speak as well.
No, I did not bounce around any rooms. So I stayed in one room and we had a really great conversation. And I'm sure all of the other breakout rooms were similar. I just put in a book recommendation called Price of Admission. It has a real US focus, but I think for anyone that might be unclear as to why diversity matters, reading that book for me really helped me see the fuller picture of, some of the systemic challenges we face at a macro level. So would highly recommend to anyone also working in higher ed, even though not necessarily the US.
Wonderful. Well, we won't have time to go through all of the breakout groups today, but what I hope is that everyone started really good conversations. It sounds like you did. There is a post program survey there in the chat that we hope that you'll all take that will give us some feedback. And if there's interest and desire to continue these conversations, if there are ways ISEP can be helpful in facilitating them, making them go deeper, we would love to do this. Also, if there are ways we can help ensure that you all have contact information so that you can continue kind of the conversation that you began, we also want to try to do that, facilitate that. Join us as well. We have future sessions of conversation starters. We're going to do a session in June that intersects with Lynn's specialty as we look at international education and climate change in the Pacific region with Ohio State climate change expert and Vice Provost Gil Latz and Elisa Lamont of the Climate Action Network for International Educators. So many really important topics in the field. This was just the beginning of a conversation. Our next one on climate change will be coming up, but if there are ways we can continue to facilitate and support your work on diversity and inclusion, let us know. And thank you all for attending.